Before we dive into this powerful story, comment below where you're watching from and what time it is right now. This is a story that will shake you, make you angry, and hopefully make you believe that justice is still worth fighting for. Picture this: a woman standing in the middle of a sun-scorched parking lot, desperately searching through the front seat of her black SUV. Her brow is furrowed, sweat beads tracing down her temples as she flips through receipts, folders, and stray papers, whispering to herself, "Come on, come on." This isn't just a frantic morning moment. This is the moment everything changes. Her name is Danielle Lawson, and she's not just anyone, though you wouldn't know that from the way she's being watched. She's the state attorney for the district, one of the most powerful legal figures in the city. But right now, she's being seen as just a suspicious black woman in a nice car. She doesn't know it yet, but an officer is about to rewrite her day and try to reduce her life to a false narrative. In the distance, the soft hum of an approaching vehicle grows louder. Danielle glances up from under her lashes, her heart skipping a beat as she sees a police cruiser slowing down, creeping through the lot like a predator eyeing uncertain prey. Her stomach tightens. Not today, she thinks. Please, not today. But the cruiser stops. The door creaks open. A pair of polished boots hit the pavement with deliberate weight. She doesn't need to look to know what's happening. She already feels the judgment, the assumption, before the first word is spoken. "Hey!" The voice is gruff, impatient, almost accusatory. Danielle slowly straightens up, hands still open, body language non-threatening. She knows how this works. She spent years in courtrooms defending justice, but here, in this empty lot, none of that matters. "What do you think you're doing?" the officer barks, walking toward her. He's white, middle-aged, and wearing a scowl like it's stitched into his face. His name tag reads Mulligan. His right hand hovers near his belt, not his gun yet, but close enough to speak volumes. Danielle forces a calm she doesn't feel. "I'm looking for my purse," she says evenly. "I must have dropped it somewhere in the car. I'm late for a meeting." She gestures toward the open door of her SUV. Her voice is steady, but her mind is racing. If she misses that meeting, her office will panic. Her phone has already buzzed 3 times. Mulligan narrows his eyes. "Got ID on you?" he asks, his voice sharp. Danielle shakes her head slowly, hands slightly raised. Not high, not dramatic, just visible. "No, I just told you, my purse is what I'm looking for. My wallet, my ID, it's all in there." Mulligan steps closer, eyes scanning her as if trying to find a reason not to believe her. "Uh-huh," he mutters. "Step away from the vehicle." Danielle hesitates. Her purse is literally in that car, but something in Mulligan's tone tells her this isn't a suggestion. This is a demand. She takes a slow step back, her breath catching in her throat. "This is my car," she says more firmly this time. "I'm the state attorney. I just need a second to—" Mulligan cuts her off with a laugh, a cruel, mocking sound. "State attorney?" he says, like the title is a punchline. "Sure you are. Got any proof of that?" Danielle's eyes narrow. "I told you, my ID is in my purse, in the car." But Mulligan isn't listening. Not to her words, not to the years she spent building her career, not to the truth. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious," he says, pulling out his handcuffs. "I've seen this 100 times. You people always have a story." Her heart drops at those words. You people? She's heard them before. In courtrooms, behind closed doors, in the casual venom of systemic bias. But now, they're not just words. They're a prelude to injustice. "Turn around," Mulligan says, voice cold. "You're under arrest. Suspicion of vehicle theft." "Are you serious?" Danielle breathes, her voice cracking with disbelief. "I told you, this is my car." But it's too late. The cold metal snaps around her wrists, biting into her skin. Her heart pounds with fury, shame, and surreal disbelief. In seconds, she's pushed toward the cruiser, the sun still beating down, the world still spinning, but her reality has just been torn apart. This is how it begins. Not with a crime, not with evidence, but with an assumption that her skin color was enough to make her guilty. And if you think this is just about one woman and one officer, keep watching. Because what happens next will expose a system designed not to protect, but to control. This is the story of Danielle Lawson and what happened the day she was arrested for looking through her own car. Danielle Lawson sat in the back of the police cruiser, her hands cuffed tightly behind her, her wrists already sore from the pressure of the cold metal. The seat was hard, the interior reeking of stale sweat and vinyl, and despite the blazing afternoon sun outside, the air inside felt suffocating. She leaned her head back against the headrest, trying to process what had just happened. Her mind raced. This couldn't be real. She'd prosecuted criminals for years, sat across from men who had done unspeakable things. And now, here she was, in the same position as the people she had fought to hold accountable. Through the tinted window, she could still see Officer Mulligan walking slowly around her SUV, peering inside with his flashlight, despite it being the middle of the day. It wasn't about evidence. It was about dominance. Every movement he made seemed more for show than substance. He wasn't looking for truth. He was looking to confirm the story he had already written in his head. Danielle's phone had buzzed several more times before the arrest. Calls, no doubt, from her office, wondering where she was. She should have been in court by now, delivering an argument in front of a judge, not sitting here like some criminal in cuffs. Her jaw clenched. Her breath came shallow. Across the lot, a couple of pedestrians walked past and stole glances at her through the windshield. Their eyes held pity, maybe judgment. No one stopped. No one asked questions. Just another black woman in the back of a squad car. An image that didn't need context, didn't get it. The cruiser door suddenly opened. Mulligan appeared, his face twisted into that same smug expression she was growing to despise. "Still no ID," he said, like he was waiting for her to crumble. Danielle kept her tone level, refusing to give him the satisfaction. "It's in my purse," she repeated, "in the car. If you let me get it, I can prove everything I've said." "Right," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "And next, you'll tell me you're a rocket scientist, too." Danielle could hardly believe how cavalier he was being. "Look," she said, forcing herself to speak slowly and clearly. "I'm the state attorney. If you check the vehicle registration or even run my name, you'll see that what I'm saying is true." Mulligan scoffed. "State attorney. You expect me to believe that someone like you just happens to be digging through a car in a parking lot with no ID and a sob story?" Danielle felt a cold fire building in her chest. "Someone like me?" she repeated, her voice sharp. "What exactly does that mean, officer?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The implication hung heavy between them. "Step out," he ordered. "We're done here." Danielle hesitated. She had a right to be furious, but she knew better than to push him right now. Not in this moment. Not with those cuffs still digging into her wrists. She stepped out of the car, standing tall despite the weight pressing down on her. Mulligan reached for her arm to guide her, but she pulled away, glaring at him. "I can walk," she said curtly. He said nothing, just directed her toward the front of the cruiser, where another officer, a younger one, stood waiting with a clipboard in hand. The younger officer looked uneasy, glancing between Danielle and Mulligan, clearly sensing something wasn't right. "She says she's a state attorney," Mulligan said with a shrug, his voice laced with mockery. "Doesn't have her ID, though, so we're booking her for attempted vehicle theft." Danielle stared at the younger officer, her voice firm. "You haven't even run my plates. You haven't checked the car's registration. You haven't asked for my name? All of that information is in your system, but instead, you're treating me like I'm invisible." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Shouldn't we let her make a call?" he asked, voice tentative. "She's been here for a while." Mulligan waved a hand dismissively. "She'll get her call when I say she does." Danielle bit the inside of her cheek to hold back everything she wanted to scream. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. It was power being abused in real time, and she was trapped inside it. The system she had worked her entire career to uphold was now being weaponized against her. "Who exactly are you going to call?" Mulligan said sarcastically. "The mayor? The governor? Your imaginary lawyer?" Danielle lifted her chin. "Mark Edwards," she said calmly. "My real lawyer. And when he gets here, you're going to regret how you've handled this." Mulligan smirked. Sure, he muttered. "We'll see about that." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he uncuffed her just long enough to let her dial the phone. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the fury she had been holding in for too long. The number rang once, twice. "Mark Edwards," a voice answered crisply. Danielle didn't hesitate. "Mark, it's Danielle. I'm at the precinct. I was arrested." Silence on the other end. Then his voice sharpened. "What? For what?" "They think I was trying to steal my own car," she said dryly, locking eyes with Mulligan. "I need you down here, now." "I'm on my way," Mark said without pause. "Don't say another word to them. I'll handle it." As she hung up the phone and set it gently back on the cradle, she turned to Mulligan. "Help is coming," she said simply. "And when it does, we're going to see how well your story holds up." Mulligan just rolled his eyes and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "Can't wait," he said. But there was a flicker of something else in his expression now. Doubt. And Danielle could feel the momentum shifting, ever so slightly. The minutes dragged like hours inside the precinct as Danielle Lawson sat alone in a dim, windowless room that reeked of stale coffee and dried ink, her hands resting stiffly on the metal table, her wrists still aching from the handcuffs that had dug into her skin far too long. The fluorescent light above buzzed faintly, casting a cold, bluish hue over everything, making the room feel even more sterile and detached. She kept her composure, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the door. She wasn't scared. She was furious. Furious that this was happening not to someone else, not to a name in a headline, but to her. Her entire career had been built on defending due process, on fighting against assumptions. And now, in a cruel twist, she was watching her rights be stripped by the very system she had sworn to protect. From outside the door, she could hear voices, indistinct at first, then sharper. Mark Edwards had arrived. She recognized the low, calm authority in his voice, demanding to see whoever was in charge. Moments later, the door creaked open and Officer Mulligan strolled in, his trademark smirk dulled but still lingering. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the confidence in his posture slightly cracked. Danielle didn't speak. She simply stared at him, her silence more powerful than any outburst. A beat later, Mark stepped in, tall and composed, his gray suit crisp despite the hurried drive, his expression unreadable but intense. Behind him trailed Chief David Hernandez, the commanding officer of the precinct, a man with graying hair and weariness carved into his brow, likely from decades of trying, and often failing, to balance the public's trust and the department's insular culture. "Miss Lawson," Hernandez said first, his tone professional but tinged with tension. "I understand there's been an incident." Danielle slowly stood, her voice even. "You mean your officer racially profiled me, refused to check my registration, ignored my identity, and handcuffed me in a parking lot because I looked like I didn't belong next to a black SUV?" Hernandez's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's why I'm here, to understand what happened and make this right." Mark didn't wait. "We're past understanding. Your officer arrested the state attorney for this city without cause. No verification, no background check, not even a plate run. He detained her on suspicion alone." Mulligan scoffed, trying to deflect. "She didn't have ID. She was acting suspicious. We can't just take people at their word." "And yet, you took your own assumptions as fact," Danielle snapped, her voice rising for the first time. "You made me a suspect without even asking my name. You didn't follow protocol." "You ignored it entirely." Hernandez turned to Mulligan, his eyes narrowing. "Did you verify her registration?" "She said her purse was in the car. No ID. I made a judgment call, Mulligan muttered, visibly uncomfortable now. Mark took a step forward. That's not a judgment call. That's misconduct. That's neglect. And if you don't deal with it, we will, legally, publicly, and aggressively. Hernandez exhaled, clearly realizing the storm he now stood in. I'll review the footage. Interview everyone involved. This will be investigated thoroughly. While you're at it, Danielle said coldly, ask how many other people Mulligan has treated this way. I guarantee I'm not the first. Mulligan's fists clenched slightly at his sides, but he didn't argue. For the first time since this began, the smugness was gone, replaced by an edge of panic. I didn't know who she was, he muttered. If I'd known. That's the problem, Danielle interrupted, slicing through his excuse. You should have treated me with respect regardless of who I was. You don't get to play fair only when someone has a title. The silence in the room was heavy, charged. Hernandez finally nodded. Effective immediately. Officer Mulligan is placed on administrative leave pending internal review. Mulligan looked like he wanted to protest but stopped himself, the weight of the consequences finally catching up. Danielle sat back down, her body tired but her resolve unshaken. Mark leaned in close, speaking softly. This is the beginning, not the end. She nodded slowly. We're going to make sure this never happens again, not to me, not to anyone. Hernandez turned toward her. Miss Lawson, once again, I apologize. This was unacceptable. I'd like to invite you to be part of the Oversight Committee as we review our policies. Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. If I join, I'm bringing the community with me. I'm not here for show reform. I'm here for real change. Understood, the chief replied. Then he glanced at Mulligan. You're dismissed. Wait outside. Mulligan left without a word, his footsteps heavy and uncertain. As the door shut behind him, a different kind of silence filled the room, one not of tension, but of accountability and motion. Danielle took a deep breath, the weight on her chest easing slightly, but the fire still burning. There was still a long road ahead, but at least finally the system had been forced to look itself in the mirror, and it flinched. The next morning, Danielle Lawson stood once again before the imposing brick facade of the central precinct. But this time, everything was different. She wasn't in handcuffs. She wasn't humiliated, dismissed, or silenced. She walked through the front doors with purpose, her heels clicking against the tiled floor like a drumbeat of resolve. At her side was Mark Edwards, calm as ever, holding a leather folio under one arm. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the precinct lobby, catching in Danielle's hair, illuminating the quiet fury behind her eyes. They were there for a formal meeting, one that would determine whether the police department intended to repair the damage it had done or merely sweep it under a bureaucratic rug. Chief David Hernandez waited in the briefing room, seated at the head of a long wooden table. His uniform was immaculate, his expression unreadable. Seated across from him, noticeably more tense than the day before, was Officer Mulligan. He no longer looked smug. His shoulders were tight, jaw clenched, and he avoided Danielle's gaze entirely. Danielle and Mark took their seats. No words were exchanged at first. The room hung in a heavy silence, filled only with the buzz of the overhead lights and the low hum of the city outside. Then Hernandez cleared his throat. Miss Lawson, Mr. Edwards, thank you for coming back. I want to begin by stating that we've concluded our initial investigation into Officer Mulligan's conduct during the incident. Danielle didn't blink. And? Hernandez folded his hands. It's clear from body cam footage and officer reports that proper procedure was not followed. Furthermore, Officer Mulligan failed to verify identity, neglected basic protocol, and responded with a lack of professional judgment unbecoming of his role. He turned his eyes to Mulligan, who now sat with a taut expression. Effective immediately. Officer Mulligan is terminated from the department. For a brief moment, the air in the room shifted. Mulligan stiffened, but said nothing. Danielle's eyes didn't leave him. She watched as the weight of consequences settled on his face, not just for what he had done to her, but for all the times he had likely done something similar and walked away untouched. Mark sat forward slightly. "That's the right step," he said quietly, "but it's only the first." Danielle nodded. "Agreed. Removing one officer won't fix a system built on assumptions and unchecked authority. What happened to me could have happened to countless others, people without my position, without my resources, without someone like Mark to call." She looked directly at the chief now, her voice calm but commanding. "If this department is serious about change, I want to see more than disciplinary action. I want to see reform." Chief Hernandez met her gaze. "We've begun discussions with external consultants to revise our training protocols, especially concerning racial profiling and de-escalation tactics. I would like to formally invite you to serve on the Civilian Oversight Committee. Your perspective would be invaluable." Danielle considered that for a moment. She had no desire to become the face of reform without substance. "If I join," she said clearly, "it's not to rubber stamp talking points. It's to make sure that real change happens and continues to happen, even when the cameras are gone and the headlines fade." Mulligan suddenly shifted in his seat, breaking his silence. "I didn't know who she was," he muttered. "If I had, I wouldn't have—" Danielle's voice cut clean through his words. "That's exactly the problem, Officer Mulligan. You treated me differently not because I did something wrong, but because I didn't fit your idea of who belongs. And even now, your apology is only about who I turned out to be, not about how you treated me in the first place." Mulligan's face reddened. He clenched his fists on the table but said nothing more. Chief Hernandez turned to him, his tone firm. "You've had your chance to speak. You chose not to follow procedure, and now you're facing the consequences of that decision." Mulligan rose, his face a tight mask of fury and embarrassment, and walked out of the room without another word. The door shut behind him with a muted thud. Hernandez sighed and turned back to Danielle. "You were right. This can't happen again, and we're committed to ensuring that it doesn't." Danielle exhaled slowly. "Then let's get to work, not just on training, but on how complaints are reviewed, how patterns of behavior are tracked, and how accountability is enforced from the top down. We don't need optics, we need structural change." The chief nodded, his face lined with the weight of responsibility. "You'll have full access to our internal audit, and I'll authorize a public report on the steps we're taking." Mark offered a small nod of approval. "Transparency is a start, but sustained effort is the goal." Danielle looked around the room, knowing that though Mulligan was gone, the culture that enabled him would take much longer to root out. But this moment, was the crack in the wall, and from it a new path could begin. "I didn't ask for this fight," she said softly, "but now that I'm in it, I'm not backing down." The room was quiet, respectful. Hernandez reached across the table and extended his hand. "We're behind you, Miss Lawson." Danielle shook it, firm and steady. Not as a victim, not even as a state attorney, but as a woman who had been wronged and who would make sure that justice, real justice, no longer stopped at a badge. A week had passed since Officer Mulligan's termination, yet the storm he'd left behind continued to swirl inside Danielle Lawson's chest. She sat in her office at City Hall, high above the bustling streets below, the window beside her framing a city that moved on as if nothing had happened. But for her, everything had changed. She had won, technically. The officer had been fired. The department had issued a formal apology, and she had been invited to serve on the oversight committee tasked with transforming the department's culture. On paper, it looked like justice. But Danielle knew better. She knew justice wasn't a single moment. It was a process. And for many people who looked like her, that process never even started. She leaned back in her chair, phone in hand, reading through messages from people she didn't know. Strangers had begun reaching out. Black mothers whose sons had been pulled over for fitting a description. Young women harassed while walking to their cars at night. Men detained for the crime of walking too confidently in the wrong zip code. Their stories echoed hers, but unlike her, most of them didn't have the law degree, the title, or the lawyer waiting on speed dial. Danielle had spent her career trying to reform things from within the courtroom. But now, she was beginning to understand that change had to go deeper. It had to live in the policies, yes, but also in the culture, the mindset, the biases that shaped how people in uniform saw those they were meant to protect. Her door creaked open and Mark stepped inside, a cup of coffee in one hand, a quiet look of concern in his eyes. "You okay?" he asked, offering her the drink. She took it with a small nod of thanks. "I don't feel done," she admitted. "It's like, I got justice for myself, but not for anyone else. I keep thinking, what if I didn't have this office, this name? What if I'd been someone else?" Mark didn't answer right away. He just pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "Then maybe you'd still be in a cell," he said softly. "But you're not. And that means you have a responsibility now, not just to feel frustrated, but to act." Danielle took a slow sip of coffee, her eyes drifting to the framed degrees on her wall, the plaques, the awards, all markers of success, but suddenly they felt hollow. "I want to do more," she said finally. "I've already accepted the position on the committee, but I want to take it further. I want to organize forums, safe spaces where people can come share their stories. I want every person who's ever been dismissed like I was to know they're not alone." Mark smiled slightly. "Then do it, and I'll back you every step of the way." That night, Danielle posted a simple message on her social media account. It read, "Your story matters. If you've been profiled, ignored, or mistreated by those who were supposed to serve and protect, I want to hear from you. I believe you, and I'm building something for all of us." By morning, her inbox was flooded. Hundreds of stories poured in, raw, emotional, unfiltered. People who had never spoken up before suddenly found the courage to share. Some were heartbreaking, some enraging, and all of them reaffirmed what Danielle already knew. Mulligan wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom. The real illness was systemic. Over the next few weeks, Danielle began hosting community roundtables in public libraries, school auditoriums, and even church basements. She listened, really listened, to voices long ignored. She took notes, connected people with legal advocates, invited police officials to sit in and hear for themselves. The mood in those rooms was electric. Pain, yes, but also hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, the wall between law enforcement and community could be torn down, brick by brick. One evening, after a particularly emotional forum where a teenage boy broke down recounting how his brother had been tackled for looking suspicious, Danielle stood outside the community center, her arms crossed against the autumn chill. A woman approached her quietly. She was older, wearing a faded church dress and a cardigan. "Miss Lawson," she said gently, "what you're doing matters. We've been waiting a long time for someone to not just speak, but listen." Danielle felt her throat tighten. She nodded slowly. "I'm listening," she whispered, "and I'm not stopping." Because for her, this wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about headlines or reputations. It was about rewriting what justice looked like, and who it was for. One voice at a time. Weeks turned into months, and Danielle Lawson's movement continued to grow. Not as a protest, not as a campaign, but as a community awakening. What began as a single voice demanding accountability had become a network of citizens reclaiming their right to be seen, heard, and treated with dignity. The Oversight Committee meetings became more than just policy reviews. Under Danielle's influence, they evolved into real working sessions where uncomfortable truths were spoken aloud, where departments were asked to provide transparency not only in words but in measurable outcomes. Reports that had once been hidden behind vague legal language were now being unpacked in public forums, with Danielle holding up pages and asking pointed questions. Why did this take 6 months to review? Who signed off on this dismissal? How many complaints before action is taken? Her legal background gave her credibility. Her lived experience gave her fire. But it was her unwavering persistence that gave her momentum. Officers who had once rolled their eyes at civilian oversight now sat up straighter when she entered the room. They knew she wouldn't let things slide. She wasn't there to play politics. She was there to change the rules. And she made it clear, this wasn't about her. It was about the people who filled the back rows of those community meetings. The ones who still looked down when speaking. The ones who shook as they told their stories. The ones who thought no one would ever believe them. Danielle believed them. She remembered what it felt like to be dismissed in a single glance, to be reduced to a stereotype, to be restrained by metal cuffs that said, "You don't belong here." But now she belonged, and she was making space for others to belong too. One morning, Danielle was invited to speak at the police academy, something that hadn't happened in the department's history. At first, she considered declining. The idea of standing in front of a room full of recruits in uniform, many of whom might already have inherited their own quiet prejudices, made her uneasy. But Mark reminded her, change doesn't happen in comfortable rooms. So she went, and she stood in front of rows of straight-backed cadets, their faces young, some eager, some skeptical, some unreadable. She didn't begin with her title, she didn't lead with her resume. She began with the parking lot. She told them what it felt like to be assumed guilty for being present. She recounted the humiliation of being handcuffed without cause, and then she said, "Some of you will be the next Mulligan, unless you choose differently." The room was silent. She let it sit. Then, quietly, she added, "But some of you will be the ones who change everything. Because you'll stop, you'll listen, you'll ask, you'll verify before you assume. And those choices, those tiny moments, will save lives. They will rebuild trust. They will make you better officers and better human beings." A few heads nodded. A few looked away. But one cadet in the front row, Latino, early 20s, the name Rivera stitched into his uniform, raised his hand. "What if we do everything right?" he asked. "But the system still protects the wrong people." Danielle met his gaze without flinching. "Then your job," she said, "is to refuse to be silent, because silence is how the wrong people stay protected." After the session, Rivera approached her privately. "My father was profiled when I was a kid," he said. "He still flinches when he sees a cruiser." Danielle nodded gently. "Then be the officer that makes someone else's father feel safe." As she walked out of the academy that morning, the sunlight cutting across the asphalt like a path, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope that wasn't just symbolic, but concrete, small, earned, real. Back at City Hall, the forums continued. New volunteers joined. Legal clinics were launched. Officers like Rivera began attending meetings not because they were forced, but because they wanted to learn. Danielle knew the road ahead would be long. There would be setbacks. Politicians would posture. Funding would be threatened. Old habits would dig in. But for every inch of progress, she saw seeds being planted. Not reforms imposed from above, but accountability demanded from below. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't fast, but it was happening. One story, one step, one reform at a time. And Danielle Lawson was no longer just surviving the system. She was changing it from the inside out. The day Danielle Lawson walked into the state capitol to deliver her testimony, the weight of every name, every story, every moment of injustice she had carried over the past months came with her. She wasn't there just as the state attorney anymore. She was there as a woman who had been handcuffed without cause, a black woman who had been assumed criminal because of her skin, and a citizen who refused to let that experience end with a private apology and a quiet promotion. The chamber was full. Press lined the walls. Lawmakers sat in suits behind rows of polished wood, and rows of observers filled the gallery above. Danielle stood behind the podium, her hands steady, her voice calm, her presence undeniable. She didn't read from a script. She spoke from lived truth. She walked them through that day in the parking lot. Not just the humiliation, but the silence that followed, the hesitation of bystanders, the smirk of the man who had arrested her without even checking a license plate. She spoke of the months that followed, of the forums, the cadets, the broken trust, and hard conversations. And then she said, "What happened to me wasn't exceptional. It was expected. And that's the tragedy. I'm not here because my story is unique. I'm here because it's common. The only thing that made it visible was my title." A hush fell over the room. Lawmakers, some of whom had quietly dismissed the need for deep reform, now shifted in their seats. She continued, laying out concrete legislative proposals: mandatory bias training with accountability metrics, independent citizen review boards with subpoena power, body cam footage release policies that didn't rely on internal discretion, and protections for whistleblower officers who called out misconduct within the ranks. She didn't ask. She demanded. This is not about punishing officers. It's about protecting the integrity of law enforcement. It's about making sure that no black child grows up thinking silence is survival, and no parent has to rehearse what to say if they're pulled over after dark. Her words didn't just resonate, they echoed. Days later, her testimony was replayed across national news outlets. Editorials hailed it as one of the most forceful indictments of institutional complacency in years. But for Danielle, it wasn't about headlines. It was about leverage. And with that leverage, real change began to move. Local police departments across the state began revisiting old cases flagged by citizen complaints. A task force was formed to review dismissal patterns, exposing a long trail of uninvestigated misconduct. At the community level, Danielle's legal clinics expanded into neighboring cities. Lawyers volunteered pro bono to help people expunge minor charges, challenge false arrests, and file civil claims. What started as a painful injustice had become a legal movement. One afternoon, as Danielle stood at the back of a packed community hall listening to a young girl speak, barely 15, trembling, talking about how her older brother had been wrongly detained on his way home from school, Danielle felt the depth of why she had kept pushing. The girl's voice cracked, but she didn't stop. She ended with, "I thought no one would believe us, but now I know someone does." Danielle blinked back tears, her chest tight with something more powerful than pain: purpose. Later that night, alone in her office, she opened a notebook and began writing names, not statistics, not case numbers, just names of people she had met along this journey. She filled 3 pages. She wasn't keeping a record. She was building a reminder. These were the people who had carried her through the worst parts of the fight. They were the reason she wouldn't let the system fall back into silence. As the city's skyline blinked softly outside her window, Danielle sat back and allowed herself, just briefly, to exhale. This wasn't the end. Change didn't arrive like a verdict. It arrived like erosion, slow, unrelenting, reshaping everything over time. And she was a part of that force, not a single wave but the tide itself. When people asked her later how she kept going, how she had turned one moment of injustice into a movement, she always said the same thing: "Because I knew the story didn't end in the back of that police car. It started there." And for Danielle Lawson, that beginning was more powerful than any ending could ever be. If this story moved you, made you think, or reminded you of something you've seen or experienced, don't keep it to yourself. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear your voice. And if you believe stories like this need to be told, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. This conversation is just getting started, and your voice matters.